Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John's been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this here podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives. Difference makers who really make a difference.
Now, you can say in this episode of the Musical Innertube that we have three guests. One is Plato, Athenian philosopher. He lived between 420 and 340 BC. And where there's Plato, there's often Socrates. He's the central figure and philosopher in much of Plato's work.
We don't have them here in person. You may be surprised by that, but in fact, our guide is pretty great. He's Dr. Lantern Jack, the host of the podcast Ancient Greece Declassified, one of the Musical Innertube's favorite pods. Y'all ought to go listen to it, support it on Patreon, go to Greece with Lantern Jack, do the whole shot. As he puts it on the website, the show explores the most interesting legends, ideas, larger-than-life characters, and watershed moments from ancient Greek history that continue to shape our world today. We always choose topics that are relevant to today's world and today's challenges. Our mission is to declassify the classics, make the fruits of classical scholarship accessible and enjoyable for all.
Now, Lantern Jack and Ancient Greece Declassified have taken a fascinating turn in the last year or so. He's bringing on scholars to discuss Plato's Republic, in which Socrates tackles the nature of justice and tries to build a perfect society. Lantern Jack is taking it book by book, sometimes devoting more than one episode to each book.
It's easy to understand, exciting, and right now it's discussing this chilling question: do democracies inevitably turn into tyrannies? That's what Socrates is wondering, and it's quite a question to ask in this election year, 2022. We can't wait to hear the answer. So without further ado, here's Lantern Jack. Welcome to the Musical Innertube.
Thank you, Donald and John. It's a pleasure to be here, and what a kind and riveting introduction. You're making me want to listen to my own podcast now.
Well, you should. It's really good. Yeah, we all ought to go.
Okay, let's all go listen. And then we'll meet back here in about an hour.
I just want to say that among your many achievements, your PhD, which I think was in ancient philosophy at Princeton, has an epigraph by the Rolling Stones from "You Can't Always Get What You Want." I'm just wondering why you gave the Rolling Stones that very sort of wonderful position in your dissertation.
Well, so my dissertation was on the Stoics, right? And the Stoics were famous or notorious in antiquity for having a possibly grim view of human nature. They thought that, we're crafted by an intelligent, benevolent deity. In fact, the whole universe is an intelligent, benevolent deity, and we're pieces of that divine mechanism. And all we can do is basically cooperate with that structure. So it's like we're these cogs in a machine. It challenges the notion of free will. And so one of the critics of the Stoics, named Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, he said the Stoics reduce humans to rocks rolling around, or as I like to say, they reduce humans to rolling stones. And so I thought that was funny because the Rolling Stones have a song called "You Can't Always Get What You Want," which is exactly the point of Stoic philosophy. You can't get what you want, but you can always get what you need.
I've heard you talk about the Stoics at length, and you actually think that the Stoics aren't this grim bunch in reality, that their ancient reputation was probably not wholly fair.
Yeah, I mean, they probably were not the most exciting people to, go to a party with, but yeah, I think there's this line I read in the scholarship early on in my PhD research that really challenged me and stuck with me, which was that this scholar was claiming that the Stoics represent the kind of fulfillment or pinnacle or end state of what Plato and Aristotle started. And that was really shocking to me when I read it, but over time I kind of came to somewhat agree with it, that, if you take all the starting points that Plato and Aristotle laid out and you follow them into their conclusion and you flesh out all the different corollaries and all the different implications and everything, you basically get Stoicism, I think. I mean, there's a few, things that you could maybe modify, but overall it is an impressive, massive, fully worked out system that builds on the earlier Greek philosophers.
In listening to your podcast, it seems like you're finding parallels between what happened in ancient Greece to their democracy and what's happening in our democracy. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is controversial because while most historians throughout most of history thought that history was an archive of examples, all of which are going to be relevant at some point again, nothing new under the sun, as the proverb goes. But since the 60s, I'd say, the modern kind of fashionable trend in academia and in history departments is to focus on the differences of different periods of time. And the kind of current way of looking at that is that history never repeats. There's no real patterns. Everything is unique, and history is endlessly variable. So I'm kind of old school. I think I think humans are the same now as they were back then. They just wear different clothes. Yeah, I mean, so this is not a given. This is not like a widely accepted point, but I do believe that there are many, many very fascinating parallels to be found in the ancient democracies.
Could you describe what the Republic is for those of us who maybe have heard of it but don't really know about the stuff that goes on in this dialogue? And by the way, folks, I read it a long time ago, and listening to Latin Jack discuss it, I realized I've forgotten just about all of it, and he's made it come alive. So what is this amazing book?
That's a tough question. On the face of it, the Republic is a dialogue. It's the account of a dialogue that happened between Socrates and a bunch of other Athenian intellectuals, in which they started off debating what the nature of justice is, and then they quickly got dragged into a discussion of what would be the most ideally just state, and then that turns into a thought experiment where Socrates and co basically imagine a perfect constitution and a perfect state. So that's the ostensible, superficial description. But I think how I would describe it is it's Plato's attempt at writing an encyclopedia of philosophy. It's got everything in it. It's got ethics, politics, psychology, aesthetics, discussions of music, of happiness, of beauty, of the afterlife, of what might happen in the afterlife. So, one of my, probably the most inspiring professor I had in college, he was this, Robert Belknap was his name. He was from an old New York family, and he studied Russian literature of all things. But he said, when you read one of these great books, whether it's the Odyssey or the Aeneid or Dante's Inferno or the Republic, you can think of any topic you want, say medicine or clothing or technology or whatever, you name it. And if you just think of that topic as you read the whole book, you will find things about that topic. Like that's the breadth of the scope of the Republic.
Is it fair to say that the Republic is the most controversial of Plato's works? I mean, my memory, the last time I read it, I was a graduate student at Stanford, and my memory was that everybody was yelling at each other about the Republic. And when my teacher brought in, my teacher would teach it one way, and he'd bring in his best friend, who's also a classic scholar, and the classic scholar would say, well, listen, my friends, Morris is a pretty smart guy, but, he's totally wrong. So his friend came in and said, well, my friend is wrong. And then his friend turned to him and said, no, you're wrong. And I suddenly thought, this is great. This is a great class. But my sense in doing some literature searches back then was that it was incredibly, I mean, people are still really sort of raising their voices about it. And And I'm wondering if that's because of those two major things that are tackled. First of all, the nature of justice, which surprisingly so few people have actually tried to tackle, and also the nature of the ideal state, right? The ideal government, the ideal social polity. I'm wondering if those are the reasons that people are just having such an intellectual mud wrestle 2,400 years later.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I mean, the nature of justice is something every human cares about, and in the very first book of the Republic, and by the way, book really means chapter. In the ancient times, they called a book a papyrus scroll, and there were 10 scrolls for the Republic, but it's really just, a long chapter. So in the first long chapter / scroll of the Republic, Plato has Socrates debunk several common definitions or conceptions of justice. And I argue in my podcast that all of our modern senses of what justice are basically included in that discussion and dispensed with. So it's almost impossible to read that and not get offended because your conception of justice is, debunked, so to speak, right away. So yeah, the Republic is, I think I say in my podcast, it's like getting punched in the face every few pages, when you read it. It's that it challenges so much of what people take for granted.
Jack, in listening to the podcast about the Republic that you're doing, it's an interesting point to me that a lot of, I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier, a lot of things that we're looking at now, you found happening in Athens back in the 400s BC. For example, there's a point where you talk about the world being connected at the time. They were pretty well connected with trade routes and so forth everywhere from Spain to India. And yet people were taking sides on issues and dividing themselves and fighting each other over things. In other words, it being connected didn't seem to homogenize everybody. It just seemed to bring out all of the differences. And when Athens would get together to vote on things in the assembly, they would yell at each other, and nobody could get to the same point. So in other words, it all seems to go into that pot, that mix that says democracy eventually eats itself alive and tyranny results. So how do we take those lessons from back there and apply them to what we're going through right now with the political discourse that we're having?
Well, there's like 5 questions embedded in that one question.
Take your time.
But
but you see, that's what happens with this book. Everything opens up, and it's what's happening now in our society. We are talking about these things.
Maybe before we get to the lessons, let's try to establish some parallels, right? So I think the most striking one is polarization. I think, the 3 of us grew up in a country where we didn't think of polarization much, but in the past, 8 years, it's suddenly become very polarized. And when I was still in grad school and our country was getting very polarized, I thought, did this happen in ancient times? Because I don't remember any discussions in any courses on polarization or anything like that. And I thought, okay, what would the ancient Greek word for polarization or for factional division be? And after looking at various dictionaries and other secondary sources, I found the term is stasis, which literally means a standstill, like stasis in English, but it acquired a technical meaning, and it just meant anything from factional division or polarization to outright civil war and violent political purges. All that was included under the term stasis. So then I did a search, like a backwards search, of the sources. I looked at where does this word stasis appear, and I found it everywhere, like in Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, Polybius, like every single author was obsessed with this term. And I was like, how did I never notice this? How was this never taught in any course? And I asked one of my professors of history at Princeton, how come nobody ever discusses stasis anymore? And he said, well, it used to be all the rage in my advisor's generation, so 2 generations back from me. But somehow it just stopped being a concern. I guess, during the post-World War II peace and prosperity that the world experienced for 70 years, polarization just kind of stopped being a concern and scholars stopped discussing it. Now it's a concern again, and so I think we're seeing a renewed interest in it. But yeah, so that is all over the Greek text, and I think the interesting insight for me was that as soon as the Greeks moved away from monarchical rule and tried to establish more cooperative or constitutional systems where there's power shared by a ruling class and people hold offices and there's term limits and everything, when you get that kind of system, or when you try to implement that kind of system, stasis seems to be a feature rather than a bug. And so the genius of the Athenian system was that the laws were so good that they prevented stasis from destroying the state for a full century, So maybe we should look at it as a success story rather than a failure, because it lasted 100 years. And then the Romans came along and they were able to prevent stasis from occurring and destroying their state for 400 years. So maybe if we look at the evolution of constitutions and systems of government over that first millennium BC, we can see what worked better for which states, and that might help us.
Socrates is no fan, it seems to me, of democracies. He lists things that I think all of us would find, if we thought about it for a moment, fairly familiar. For example, that democracies are inherently unstable. But seriously speaking, I mean, that is what a democracy is. It's always experimental. It's always most democracies really are always sort of not finished or unstable in some important way. But also there's things such as, if everybody's equal, people start getting jealous of privilege from one group to another. So there's faction. And and I think all I'm doing is sort of giving more detail to Don's question, which is this is a litany of many of the things that we're seeing now, or we have seen. And although it's hard to know whether you can really apply the parallels too closely, we have many of the things that Socrates would look at, I think, and say, well, you see, the other thing about democracies is that they don't always make good decisions. They, the Athenian democracy, would have votes on everything, and sometimes the votes led to disaster. Shouldn't this scare us?
I'm not sure. I mean, first of all, it's hard to say how much of that is actually Socrates' view and how much of it is Plato's views put into Socrates' mouth, since we don't have Socrates' own writings. But
fair enough.
Plato's writing about this after the collapse, right? He's writing about this after Athenian democracy collapsed. There was a tyrannical government that killed a bunch of democrats, and then those tyrants were killed as well, and then democracy was restored, and then Socrates was, executed by the Democracy 2.0, largely for being friends with some of the tyrants. So, Plato's writing about this from a position of trauma. He's traumatized by what he's seen, and so for him, these features of democracy, which we might just see as, okay, a little bit messy, a little bit disorganized at times, but overall a good thing, for him, there's a much more gloom and doom aspect to those symptoms of democracy.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment, but first, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Dr. Lantern Jack, not his real name, is the host of the podcast Ancient Greece Declassified, one of the Musical Innertube's favorite pods. It's a great down-to-earth tour of the big names, legends, and historical moments from ancient Greek history. We're big fans of his podcast, and we want you to be too.
He's also recently become a great tour guide, taking busloads of people around the big places in the ancient world a couple of times a year.
Dr. Lantern Jack holds a PhD in ancient philosophy from Princeton University, and he's also research director at the Anacyclosis Institute, where he studies patterns and cycles throughout human history.
You can find Ancient Greece Declassified on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere you get your podcasts. And now, let's return to Dr. Lantern Jack on the musical Innertube.
I guess one of the things that comes to mind that John was referring to and that you've talked about on the podcast, and that is that democracy in its ideal form gives everybody a voice. And I'll give you a story. People ask me, I was a television reporter for years, and people ask me, well, what's it like? And I'll say, well, here's a good example. I go to a school board meeting, and there's 20 people at the school board meeting, which kind of overpopulates it. There's usually only about 5 or 6, but say it's a really popular one. And the school board comes up with a plan, and out of those 20 people that are there, 19 totally agree with the plan and say it's right. And there's one guy in the back who doesn't. And he comes to the microphone and he calls them all Nazis, and he says it's a terrible plan. So I asked these people, who do you think gets the TV time? It's going to be the Nazi. Or the guy they're calling the Nazis. So this is sort of what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of democracy, in that everybody gets a vote, but the person that screams the loudest gets the results. So is that kind of what we're talking about here? Is it, the flaw in democracy is that everybody gets a vote, or everybody gets a voice, and sometimes the loudest voice wins?
That's definitely part of it. I mean, you got to keep in mind that the Athenian democracy was much more direct than ours. So, we cannot vote on whether the U.S. goes to war or not, but the Athenians could vote. In fact, they had to vote. Wars could not be declared without a public assembly vote. And also, you and I cannot speak in front of the Congress unless we're invited, whereas in the Athenian assembly, every citizen could theoretically get up and speak. So it was kind of like the school board meeting where anybody can show up and speak, and this obviously led to certain issues that had to be worked out, and also there were weaknesses that could be exploited by demagogues. Over the 2 centuries of Athenian democracy, you get demagogues being increasingly more and more prominent. And, the art of rhetoric was developed at this time. And I think we can think of ancient rhetoric as modern PR or social media. It played the same function. It was a social technology that was developed for certain people to gain disproportionate publicity through these assemblies, and to get all the publicity and to get all the attention and all the talk of the town around them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there were similar weaknesses to the system as we see today, with, a lot of our social media companies controlling what we have access to in terms of information and everything. But I think, Plato doesn't want to get rid of democracy completely. I think what he and Aristotle and Polybius say is that you need a mix of the 3 archetypal governmental forms. In other words, you need to have some monarchical element, some oligarchic element, and some democratic element combined in a hybrid form, because each of those 3 archetypal tendencies exist there anyway. And if you try to completely suppress one or the other, it's not going to work. So you kind of, like, there is, we all want to follow one leader at certain times. We all defer to expert authority at certain times, but we also all want to have a voice at certain times. And so I think what the ancient thinkers concluded, and something that the Romans actually implemented later, is this mix of the 3 systems, so that at any given time there is somebody who has something like monarchical power, there is some body that has oligarchic power, but the people also are able to assemble and have their say. And then the idea was that by having that kind of hybrid, you could minimize the defects of each individual system of government as if it were implemented all by itself.
I think you could see traces of that in what the founders did with the Constitution, because all of those elements may be a little bit different. Like, we don't have a king, but we do have a president who is supposed to preside over a cabinet, and you have the right to redress grievances. That's not really very well defined in the Constitution, but it's there, and we have a Senate and a Congress. And I think you see Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and several others who have definitely read this. If anybody ever wants to read the Federalist, it's quite a thing, and you can just see them explaining exactly why they designed this way. And I think Plato's right in the middle of that. This dialogue's right in the middle of it. You see the same thing?
Yeah, the funny thing is that I think Jefferson and Adams didn't like Plato very much. I was just reading a letter from Adams to Jefferson where he said that he finally got around to reading Plato, and what a bunch of, ridiculousness that was. But they loved Polybius, and Polybius can be seen as a continuation of Plato's philosophy in these matters. And yeah, I think you're totally right. Like, the presidency is the monarchic element in our state. The Supreme Court could arguably be seen as an oligarchic element because it's not elected and it's appointed, and it's very long. All the justices hold their offices for very long periods of time. And the two houses of Congress are arguably the more popular element. And actually, the founders were most concerned with the popular element. Having read Polybius and others, they thought that, the democratic element of the state is the one that's most liable to getting out of control. And so the reason they made it a bicameral system was so that the Senate and House could keep fighting each other and not fight against the rest of the state.
I agree with that. It's funny because to me, one of the most Platonic elements of what they did was they made sure that it wasn't a direct democracy. They made sure it was representative, that there was one house that moved very slowly and another house, was basically running for re-election all the time. And I'm talking about the House of Representatives. So they gave a way to represent the public, but it's not what the Athenians had, which is every landowning native male, being required to vote on everything that the government did. They thought that way madness lay. So to me, that sounds like the most Socratean or Platonic element in what they did, was to make sure, no, the one thing we don't want is a direct non-representative democracy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the word democracy, not only in Plato, but also in Aristotle, is basically it's a derogatory term. For Aristotle, so there were three archetypal forms of government, and each form had a good and a bad version. So there was rule by one, which could be a kingdom, which is good, or a tyranny, which is bad. There was rule by a few, which could be an aristocracy, which is good, or a oligarchy, which is bad. And then there was rule by the many, and Aristotle calls the good version of that a politeia, or republic, and a bad version of that democracy. Whereas for Polybius, the good version of that was democracy, and the bad version of that was ochlocracy, which means mob rule.
Yeah.
So Polybius had a more favorable reading of democracy, and for him it was a good term. But for the founders, democracy was mob rule, basically, which is why no American statesman referred to the U.S. as a democracy until decades later, when I think in the late 1800s, when America became obsessed with discovering Greek antiquity, and also certain texts were discovered that brought the Athenian world to light as it hadn't been before. And then America went through a kind of Greco-mania, and we started calling ourselves a democracy for the first time.
Instead of a republic, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Lantern Jack, this is such a great discussion. I wanted to make some more time for some of the other things that you do on your wonderful podcast, Ancient Greece Declassified. I wanted to mention your episode entitled Time Traveling in the Ancient World. And in this, you ask dozens of scholars the question, if you could travel back in time, who's the person in the ancient world you'd most want to meet? It's totally delightful. I hope people do listen to it. I played it for somebody who doesn't have a background in ancient studies at all, and they loved it. They were delighted. They started counting on their fingers. Okay, Socrates has 5 votes. And I was, it was sort of, this person made it a horse race, said, no, I wouldn't want to meet that guy, But did anything surprise you about the results of your little poll?
Oh, actually, there is something that surprised me, which I did not include in the published episode. So this is like an insider scoop, okay? But so there was one guest I had, and I asked him the same question. Like if you could go back in time, who would you like to meet and why? And he just couldn't answer it. He's like, I just don't want to go back, And I was like, okay, but you study, and I don't want to give away the name here, but okay, you study this fragmentary author of whom we have just a few pieces of text. You wouldn't want to go back and get the whole book? And he was like, not really. So that was kind of shocking to me, because it was like he liked being this, I guess, this fragmentary scholar. He liked being the detective that works with small bits of information, and he just didn't seem to have a greater curiosity to uncover the missing parts. I could see that he was displeased by the question, so I didn't even include it in the compilation.
Well, let me go back to something you said earlier in the podcast, and that is basically you are of the mind of those who do not learn from history repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
That old adage. So what would your recommendation be to keep us all in one piece and to keep us all from getting hysterically torn apart?
My view is that the answers to our problems are all there in the ancient texts, and they're not even that hard to find, but no one talks about them in any major media outlet or public sphere. And one example of this is, I asked a bunch of my guests on my program, what do you think the biggest lesson is for, saving democracy? And the most common answer I got was, well, you need a healthy middle class. And this is in all the ancient authors. I mean, Aristotle says explicitly, if the middle class is not greater in size than the rich and the poor taken together, you just can't have a democracy. And we are seeing our middle class dwindle. I mean, this is brought up, but you never see any substantive conversations about how you might actually bolster the middle class. And all the conversations you do hear are, pretty inane, I would say. So I think that's, if you want to isolate one major issue, like everything else is a downstream from that. I think polarization, factional division, hatred between different parties, all that. If there's one factor that contributes to all those more than anything else, it's economic inequality increasing and the middle class decreasing. And that's what we're seeing now. And, again, Plato and Aristotle and others have recommendations about how you can preserve the health of the middle class, but those don't make it to the modern debate stage.
Good point. Listen, I want to stop by talking about one thing that the podcast has been doing recently. You started doing, am I correct, guided trips to the ancient world?
Yeah, we have our own time machine, and can only take about 25 people. But yeah, sometimes
Yes.
one person will be left stranded in the space-time continuum, but it's just a small amount of collateral damage.
It's like that line from the Firesign Theater. I've been to ancient Greece. I have proof. Just look at this grape. But we'll talk about where you've gone and where you're going. What kind of people are signing up? It sounds like you'd be the ideal guide to take us to the contemporary sites of many of the ancient events and people.
yeah, well, so following on the footsteps of other podcasters that did the history of Rome and the history of Byzantium, I got inspired by their podcast trips and tours. So I figured I should, do that as well. And it was, we did the first one last August. I got 23 people to join, and we spent 8 days, got our own bus, got our own tour guide, who was a professional archaeologist named Aristotle, to help us. and he was totally awesome. And yeah, we spent just 8 days traveling to all the famous sites of the Peloponnese, Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos. This will sound like a boast, and maybe it is, but nobody can put a tour of of modern Greece together like I can. And let me explain what I mean by that. There are people who know more ancient history than me. There are people who know how to put a tour together better than me. There are people who know Greece better than me. And there are people who know how to have fun better than me. But you're not going to find somebody that combines all four of those like me. So, we had like great time in the evenings, just drinking together and having fun, discussing, and then, getting up in the morning and hiking to all these ancient sites. And Aristotle and I always picked the best restaurants to have amazing food. And it was just amazing. Like, everybody there was a history geek. So we all just had a lot of common, starting points to talk about. And the next one I'm doing is in January, and it's going to focus on northern Greece and on mountains and oracles in particular. So if anybody's interested about that, go to greacepodcast.com/tour to find out about it. So thanks for asking me, by the way.
And of course, if they go to greacepodcast.com, they would hear the podcast that we've been talking about this whole time.
Exactly.
Great. And by the way, inspired by all that, we're thinking of maybe starting a tour of our own for the Innertube here, where people can explore John Tempaine's living room. And nobody can take you through John Tempaine's living room better than John Tempaine. So be listening for that. That'll be coming up soon.
I might be asking Dr. Lantern Jack for some pointers about how to get through it, how to navigate it. Dr. Lantern Jack, this has been just a very stimulating, thought-provoking half hour. We want to thank you so much for making yourself available. The name of your podcast is Ancient Greece Declassified. It talks straight about the ancients in a way that anyone can understand, and yet it doesn't dumb a thing down. It tries to make it all available for you. I want to thank you for coming on the Musical Innertube.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both, and I love your show. I've been listening to your back catalog, so thanks for doing what you do and for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Check out our website at musicalinnertube.com, where you'll find all our episodes, profiles of our guests, and lots of extras. You'll even be able to leave us a voicemail.
Our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. On Twitter, our handle is minnertube. Capitalize the M and I.
The Innertube is available on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iHeartRadio podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.